Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. I'm delighted to have Tom Gilb back. He's a systems engineer. He's an inventor. He's done amazing things. He's written, I don't know how many dozen books. And today he's going to apply the systems engineering ideas to personal life and say, okay, how do you design your life and how do you use principles in the process of doing that? All right, so welcome, Tom.
Thank you. Pleased to be back.
Wonderful. So let's jump into it right away. What are principles?
Well, again, I have a formal definition of them, and many other people have different formal definitions. So there's not one simple answer. But for me, they're ways of summarizing knowledge in such a way that it can be used on a wide variety of problems, systems, as in systems engineering. And I like to focus on what I call deep principles. That is, they're non-trivial and they have a big effect when you use them. So those are the ones I collect. A friend of mine, Billy Cohen from University of Austin, Texas, calls them heuristics. And he believes that engineering is primarily defined by using engineering heuristics, but they're the same things that I call principles. For me, they're just a practical way whenever I write a paper or a talk or books, it's a way of summarizing things so that people can either just read that and not have to read too much, or for example, I wrote an 800-page book, but every 8 pages or so, I had one principle that summarized things. So in fact, here's a version of that book where I just took the 100 principles themselves and put them into a little book. So you only had to read the principles and not the other 600 pages of the book. You'll find this on my website, by the way.
Excellent. So let me ask, many of almost all of us who are here are care about our lives, and we are trying to improve our lives relentlessly. We're trying to do everything to improve our lives. Why use principles in the process? What is the function of principles?
Well, again, they're like everything. There are probably good principles and bad principles, at least for you. In other words, some things that somebody claims is a principle, but it won't work for you, and maybe it won't work for anybody. And then there are these deeper principles which will possibly work for you. The reason we don't call them laws is because they won't always work for everybody. So it's a little bit of humility. You back off and say, well, I'm not promising this will always work, and it won't always work for everybody under all circumstances. But think about it or try it out lightly and see if it works for you. Well, I'll stop there for the moment.
Okay. So how do you arrive at a deep principle? What is the process through which you arrive at a principle? We've talked about application of principles, but how do we come up with principles in the first place?
Okay. Well, first, it's for me, it's a very conscious effort when I write for example, almost every time I write a talk or a paper, of which I have a few hundred on my website, gilb.com, I'm going to summarize this in 10 principles, exactly 10. So it's extremely conscious. I'm going to do 10. And the other thing is I just simply ask myself, what's the most important idea I'm trying to convey here? And how can I put it in just a short sentence, pithy? And but then I ask myself a few other questions. Is it deep and significant? In other words, is it non-trivial? Having a principle saying you should breathe isn't really very interesting. Most of us quite capable of doing that. But having a principle saying that you shouldn't have specific tactics or strategies and call them your objectives for life, like taking a university degree or taking a job, that's a pretty deep principle. You need to ask, why do I want to do that university education, or why do I want to take that job? And the answer to why is usually closer to the real objective. Like it could be make money, it could be get learning. So by the way, that's another very powerful principle. If you ask why,
Mhm.
the answer is always one higher level of concern. And it's a very nice way of separating ends and means. There's a famous Einstein quote basically saying that people are still very confused about ends and means. That must have been about 1951, and they still are.
Mhm.
So when I read even businessmen setting objectives for things, I constantly find that over half of everything are not really their objectives. They're actually strategies, specific things they're going to do that they believe will lead them to their objectives, but they haven't actually formulated their objectives. So there's no way of asking, will this strategy really lead to the objective? No way of testing, did this strategy really lead? So one of the biggest problems in life design itself, as well as all other kinds of planning, is when people mix the ends and the means and state something as their objective when it really is just the first strategy they thought of. That's an extremely common error. And since Einstein's statement, things haven't changed much. There's something inherently human. I think it's because the strategies are very concrete and the objectives can be very abstract. Like, I want to be very happy.
Mhm.
Okay. And, very concrete. I'd like to have $1 million tomorrow extra. That's a very concrete idea.
Excellent. Now, um, I noticed that you often use 10 principles. So
Yeah,
just at an epistemological level, why is it, yes, okay,
that's it.
got it. Okay, so that's a great answer, but let me let me pose the question this way. What's wrong with having just one principle, and what's wrong with having 3,553 principles?
Okay. Well, I was also going to say that more than one principle gives a more richness of ideas, and some people need maybe only a few of the principles to do what they're going to do, and I don't know which ones in advance. So by giving them at least 10, it's more probable that at least one will be useful, and maybe some more. Now, there's the obvious answer to your second question. There's something called too many principles.
Yes.
There's a famous statement which was not said by Einstein, and we can prove that, but many people think it was, but it's a beautiful principle. Things should be as simple as possible, but no simpler.
Wonderful, wonderful.
And I
So,
love the principle. Now, I was lucky enough to quote that as Einstein's principle in a book I wrote in 1988
mhm,
called Principles of Software Engineering Management in
mhm.
19, yeah. And then we did some research and we finally tracked down the fact that nobody could prove Einstein ever said that, but he did come close to saying many similar things. He just didn't say that exact thing. So I thought, goodness me, I can claim that I said it because Einstein didn't, and it's in my book. Well, you can credit that particular principle to me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom. So again, I want to focus on the process before we dive into these 10 principles. So how do you manage to reduce, what is the process by which you come to these 10? Do you and start making kind of a lower level principles, then move towards deeper principles? How do you do that?
No, yeah, I rarely have what I call a hierarchy of principles, even though in many other areas I'm fanatic about hierarchies and organizing things that way. So they tend to be independent, but perhaps related is one thing I could say. But I simply ask myself, I have a few slides here, a few pages. How would I sum that up so that people would get the essence of what I want to communicate to them? And how would I sum it up? Usually in the format of, if you do X, Y will follow, or if you don't do Y, X will follow, or something like that. It gives them a rule to to use in many different situations. So I'm looking for that rule. Then the other thing I do, which I want to emphasize right away, um, I ask myself, would this principle have been valid in Egyptian times when they're building pyramids?
Mhm.
And I think about it and say, why not? You know, if I were Pharaoh, I would have used that. And then I say, has it been useful for me for my approximately 60 years of practice in systems engineering? Yep. Okay. Can I see any reason why in a few hundred years from now, when technology and society is perhaps very different, can I see any reason why that principle wouldn't be valid then? Nope. Okay. I'll put it on the table. So I'm looking for what I call timeless principles or classical principles that will never go out of style, or at least have a very long half-life. So I cannot foresee they'll go out of style. So if you ask I have a little game where I take any principle at random out of 100 from my books, and I tell people in advance that when they can pick a random number, we pick a principle, and that they can judge for themselves whether this would have worked in Egyptian times, in their lifetime, and in the future. And usually, yes, they say, of course. They'll say, well, all of the 100 principles are of that nature by selection. By selection.
Excellent. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, the other thing was it's similar. You've got to be very careful not tying principles into current technology, like, well, an iPhone, take a simple example, or tweeting or something like that, because you know, these things were not there in Egyptian times, and they probably won't be there a few hundred years from now, and so you won't be able to publish them and have somebody quote them a few hundred years from now, which is my secret dream, right? I'm sort of hoping that a lot of what I write is so advanced for the culture we're in that maybe only 1% of all those people I think should use my ideas actually use them. Okay, now 1% of a few million is still a large number, but it's very unsatisfactory that 99% don't get it yet. So my hope is that by putting it in the written form and distributing it digitally, that hundreds of years from now, somebody will pick up old Gilb's stuff and say that was pretty smart stuff, and it's still valid today. You know, like picking up Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac sayings and things like that. That's my secret dream, that at least it will be more useful in the future if it's as good as I hope it is.
Absolutely. I like the way of you know, running these tests on the principles. The way in which Buckminster Fuller puts it is he's looking for general principles.
Yes. Exactly.
The way in which Louis Sullivan puts it is that he cares only about universal principles.
Good.
Because what that it's so it's basically the same approach, but I like this specific test. Is it valid a long time ago? Is it valid in the future? Has it been useful to me? So I think those are very good tests. Now, once you have these set of, let's say, you know, 10 principles, is there an organization to it? Are they in sequence? They have to be how does that work?
Well, okay, number one, sequence generally doesn't matter. They stand on their own and will, in principle, work in any sequence. Now, I'm not sure why that's so, but that is, in fact, the way it is with me. They have to stand on their own independently of all the others. Then the main thing is that together they cover the paper, the chapter, the talk. You know, they give you know, 10 different aspects, and I could instantly generate another 10 principles, but I think that's overwhelming people. They can, if you know, they can read there comes a point where they can read the detail, and I just need to give them a way of remembering what I was trying to say, and a way of maybe communicating it to other people that they can quote my. But by the way, I had an experience many years ago in. Maybe it was about 71, I published something in a computer magazine, which was the most popular one then, called Datamation. And it was Gilb's Laws of Reliability. Or actually, the publisher thought it was more fun to call it Gilb's Laws of Unreliability. And the first law is that computers are unreliable, but people are even more unreliable. Okay. Now, it turns out that there was a time when I could go every day into Twitter and find somebody who had quoted me, you know, 50 years later on those laws. I could walk around streets of Brazil and find that my principle was on some kind of a Murphy's Law collection for tourists, translated without credit to me. Once I found somebody quoting my Gilb's laws on the internet, and I wrote him and pointed out that he might like to give the author credit. And the reply I got back was, "Oh my God, I thought you were dead." No,
Well,
Big Brother is watching you.
wonderful. So far, when you've talked about principles, you've talked about the context of capturing everything about a field and being able to communicate it to other people in concise form. Now, when it comes to using of these principles, how does that work? How the process of using these 10 principles, is it different from the principle, the way in which it is being transmitted? So how does it work, and how does person use this set of 10 principles?
Okay, now I use it to summarize, and I use it to get people to think, was that what I heard in the last 5 slides? You know, maybe I didn't get it because there's a disconnect between what I thought Tom said and what he's now saying in the principle. So it's a way of double checking things. So I have my own uses for it. Sometimes I just need to be very short in front of, say, I've got 10 minutes with an executive, and I can't exactly read my 700-page book to him, although I'd like to. It's called Value Planning.
Mm-hmm.
But I can give him one principle and say, I've analyzed your objectives and you are violating this principle. You've got nothing but, in your so-called objectives, you've got nothing but strategies and you don't have any true objectives. And and you are not going to get what you want as a result. Now, hopefully, and that's the principle. I'm teaching that principle. You can't have your future objectives of how good you want to be specific alternative means of getting there. That's a very fundamental principle in life design as well as in any kind of design or engineering. So it helps me get through a short meeting with people who are not going to give me any more time. And I'm also hoping that anybody who reads me or is a student of mine, even 100 years from now, can use it to grab people's attention. And if the attention is gained, say, I'll explain you more. Somebody will be doing a podcast or something, 100 or 200 years from now, and they'll use that as a headline, I hope, and get people's attention and say, we're going to talk for an hour about this particular principle, just like we do with Buckminster Fuller and other people.
Wonderful. So let me try to kind of capture it in my own way, because I've kind of looked at kind of different systems of principle. So what you're saying is that the principles that you have kind of sit in a circle, in the sense that they're all equal, in the sense that they are independently grounded. And even when you use them, you basically bring to bear whatever principle seems to be relevant to the thing that you are trying to do. Is that fair way of kind of saying that that's how you end up using it? So you have all the principles, all the 10 principles in front of you, or in your mind, in your memory, after you've kind of absorbed it all. And then whenever you're faced with something, you summon the principle which is most applicable, most useful in that context and apply it. Is that a good way of saying it?
I challenge you to summarize what you said as a 10-word or less principle.
The way I do it is that I do it in diagrams. So I'm very visual. Okay. So for me, it's a circle, and there are 10 points over there. And what I'm looking at is in the center. And I'm able to bring to bear any of these 10 onto it, and whichever produces the maximum impact, that's what I'm going to use now.
Okay.
So that's how I would summarize it.
Great. I love graphical methods too, and I use them considerably to get ideas across. In fact, I've even invented a graphical language called Planguage Icons, but it's in my books, which is an attempt to get like music notation or electrical notation, an international language for systems engineering. And I find that quite useful. I got inspired by a man called Charles. Goodness me, now. It'll come back to me. But he was actually an Austrian man who invented a whole graphical language, Charles Bliss. And Bliss Symbolics or Semantography, you can get his books. I actually have 2 autographed books from him because I helped finance him when nobody else would get his stuff done. But he actually created a symbolic language for human beings, which was sort of like Chinese, above the spoken language. But he tried to make it much simpler than Chinese, so many more people could have access to it. So in fact, handicapped children were using it long before most people even realized there was such a language existing. So by the way, that's almost a principle in itself, that sometimes graphical communication can communicate across different cultures and languages better than words. Okay. So highly recommend Bliss. You can also Google Bliss Symbolics and
Yes.
get samples of them.
I'm definitely going to do that. I'm very I'm just
he
very
is no
thrilled.
longer among the living, so you won't be able to invite him to the show.
But hopefully he has done something which will live on for a long time, which is all of us hope.
I believe it's said that Blaise Pascal was trying to do some of the same kind of thing, just to connect with another famous person there.
Excellent.
But yeah.
So shall we dive into the 10 life principles?
Yep. Here we actually,
all right.
I didn't actually bring a written copy. It's on my computer. Oh, well, it's okay. Life design book.
So folks,
it's not actually, the 10 principles are not in the book, as it turns out.
Sure.
Because I wrote them for an earlier version of the book in 1982. And the life design book was written 1 or 2 years ago, the new one.
Sure.
But okay, go ahead. You want to read the principle and we'll talk about it?
What I'm going to do is that I'm going to read the principle, and I will go ahead and paste these principles, maybe 3 at a time or something like that, into the chat, so people can read it while we are talking about it.
That's good.
So let me go ahead and post it first here. Okay, so the first one is, if your life goals are unclearly specified, you are unlikely to reach them. From everything I've read from you, I think this looks like one of your key points. That this is a theme that you keep coming back to in all your books. So please tell us about that.
Now, again, you're right. It's everywhere. So, for example, I wrote a book called Sustainability Planning, and I analyzed the United Nations sustainability goals. End poverty, hunger, better education. And my conclusion after rigorous and detailed examination was they were systematically unclear, like ends and means mixed, wild attempts to quantify, but bad quantifications because they just quantify things that happen to have in their statistics rather than the thing they were trying to control, and on and on and on. It's in the it's a free book, by the way, in the Creative Commons. And so my conclusion was there is no way the United Nations and all of its partners, who are now many governments and organizations working towards these goals, can attain the goals through those goals, because nobody understands them in the same way. Everybody must be confused. There's no way of proving that people understand the goals identically. And so at best, they'll muddle along, and instead of achieving the goals by 2030, which is an example of the kind of timelines they have, it might be 50 to 100 years later, we accidentally managed after, and maybe only after we've clarified the goals will we ever get there. Now that's real shame. I mean, we're talking about a lot of hungry, impoverished people, because we can't even write a clear goal at the United Nations level.
Let's apply the same principle to individual lives. Now, we don't have 50 to 100 years to waste.
No,
our lives either. So I think this is a large systemic problem. I don't think most people have their life goals clearly specified. So could you talk a little bit about what you've seen in terms of the extent to which people actually apply this principle, what they can do to apply it, Any thoughts?
Now, a few people, high attainers who you might see interviewed on television, it becomes clear that they have had really clear goals and they've gone after them with a vengeance. Think some sports stars just for, but even people who wanted to be a musical star, at 3 years old, they knew exactly what they wanted to do, and that was clear as a bell. So in other words, people, high attainers tend to have not meandered into it by accident. They had clear purpose that everybody could understand from early age, and they've worked on it very hard. They've been very ambitious, and they've reached it. Now, by the way, you can achieve an uninspiring goal like wake up tomorrow and be alive fairly easily. Okay. So what's interesting is really high attainment goals, top class, like win Nobel Prize, just to take a simple example. That's a really clear idea. And some people, I'm sure many scientists have that in mind and they're working towards it right now. Okay. So now, but most people, if you ask them, could you show me your clear goals? Most people I know, even people like yourselves who are very interested in improving their lives, they rarely say, yep, here are my goals. I've done them. Here's my little diary or my book. And what they say is, they start by saying, well, first I've got to get a university degree in X, or first I've got to get a job at Google or something like that to help my career. And I say, no. Now you've violated my first principle. You're talking about the means to get to your goals. Why would you want a job at Google? Why would you want that university degree? Okay. And then they give an answer. But let's say to the university degree, they're probably not going to say, not in the US, I want to get wiser. They're probably going to say, I want to earn a shitload of money, something like that, becoming a lawyer, something like that. Okay. Now, fine. Okay, so I simply point out what you just said to me when I said why, that is closer to your what we call a real goal or real objective. Okay, that idea of getting the lawyer education was just your first shot or cultural habit because everybody told you lawyers get rich or surgeons get rich. That was just the means to the ends. Now, it could happen that's not even the smartest means to the ends. And by the way, there's another problem. You don't have just one goal, like get rich, okay? I mean, there are exceptions, maybe like the soon-to-be former president, who knows? But actually, if you think about it, he has another goal, get attention, okay? And everybody has more than one goal. Okay, no matter how dominant one of the goals are, you can find other fairly dominant goals. So one of the first principles that I also teach is that you, and I'm hopefully, so I use even like in number 6, I talk about goals plural. Okay, so it's not so simple as to say I have one goal and I'm going to achieve it. We normally, both in business, systems engineering, and in life, have a set of goals, okay? And even a mere human being might have 5 to 10 really important critical goals that say, I want all of these, okay? And if I were missing one of them, I'd be like, I got rich, I got famous, but my family was unhappy. I'd be a mighty unhappy president-elect. So, okay, so the idea that we have multiple goals in all situations is very important, and they need to be clear. And any strategy we pull in, like getting a university education or getting elected senator from Delaware, whatever it is, has to be considered in light of all of the goals. Because if it satisfies 9 of them and totally destroys one of them, then maybe it isn't such a good strategy. Okay, so we have to evaluate all strategies against all critical goals. Now we're raising the game a little bit from just being clear about one goal and having one strategy to the many-to-many proposition of many objectives and many strategies have to be matched to each other. And that even at the level of one single human being is the way it is. We have many goals and many strategies, and they somehow have to live together and be coherent with one another. So even in the life design book, I suggest two levels of tables. Let's see if I get really lucky. And here's a very, very, very simple one. And probably can't see that very well, but can you see that it's a table?
Yes.
Okay. So what it is, it's a table where multiple goals and multiple strategies are sort of rated in a very simple rating method, like minus, 0, plus, 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 okay, to give you some idea of how those things fit together.
Tom, just I want to because people did not see it clearly. What is
Yeah.
what is in the vertical column and what is in the rows?
Okay, let's see. How could I do
No,
this?
you can just I mean, what kind of
Yeah.
things are there?
Okay. On this column,
Okay,
I have all the goals. So it actually says
health,
health,
wealth.
wealth, happiness, and the right to
Yes,
almost quoting a constitution or something like that, right?
got it.
And then across the top, it says uh, uh, diet, investment, sharing, which are different strategies. Actually, in both cases, these are the names of the objectives, not the final definition, and the names of the strategies. Now, by putting them on a table, we get a many-to-many view, and we can begin to see whether some strategies, while they are really excellent for one or two of the goals, are really useless or negative for a few others, and we've got to have a second think there. Okay?
Excellent.
So yeah, so now I find this is one of the other big problems, that people have a strong tendency to oversimplify. Back to the non-Einstein Gilb principle, things should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. Okay, trying to think about any problem with just one goal is almost always too simple, and it won't work because there are other goals, whether we acknowledge them or not, whether we treat them or not. So I try to get people to recognize, I can usually do it pretty easily. You know, I just say, what's your most important goal? Okay, what's your next most important goal? And they keep on going till we have 10 or 15. And I say, well, that was an awful lot of goals. Shall we pare them down to just 5? And they can probably do that and say, these are my top 5. And I said, imagine if you could achieve your top 5 in the coming 5 years, and we'll worry about the rest of them later. That's a prioritization method. But I get people recognizing that they have many goals, and they can't just simply go to one goal. They don't really want to. But it's very tempting to keep life simple and just have one simple goal, like get rich or be happy or something like that. But the real world doesn't submit to that idea. There's a principle that any entity, like a person or organization planning, will have many critical goals that must be considered now with regard to your strategies. I just made that up, but it sounds good, right?
Sure. I mean, the way in which I think about this is in terms of a system. You know, we are a system. We have many kind of subsystems within. For example, health is a subsystem that I have that I need to take care of. My family and friends is another one. My career is another one. My intellectual growth is another one. And all of these things actually interact with one another. So for example, if my health is not doing well, I'm not going to be able to do any of the other ones. And if my intellectual growth is stagnant, it is going to affect how I interact with my family and friends, and it'll probably impact my health as well. And same, so there are all
you brought in a level of concern that I didn't dare mention just yet, but you're spot on. It's the fact that these interact with each other. I mean, the goals interact and the strategies interact. Now, that table was complex enough without considering interactions, just, one-to-one interactions. But the reality is the butterfly principle, it all interacts with everything else. And this is terribly difficult to consider. We don't actually have enough knowledge to know in advance how things will interact, only very, very, very roughly. Okay? So, and I'm very interested in this principle because I don't want to, just because it's difficult, I don't want to fail to consider the interaction. So I have a method in the background and in all of my methods, which says, and including life design, it says the only way to figure out how these things interact, and if they do interact, is to plug in your strategies in small increments, one by one. Let's call them small wins for the moment. And then if you plug in a little bit of something, it's supposed to go very well. And all hell breaks loose. This is like Biden saying something he shouldn't say about presidents who are very charming. Okay, then you realize, thank God I didn't base my whole speech on that, and I better not ever do it again. Okay, in other words, the interactions are so tricky that the best people can do is to, like a good scientist and a good engineer, measure them in place as they happen. When you plug something in, you're plugging it into all of your goals, which it might interact with, and you're interacting with all of the existing strategies that it might interact with. So in other words, suck it and see, as a British professor liked to say, is the method, or trial and error is the other famous paradigm there. But this is so what you can do with the tables and the goals is get a pretty good approximation of things that will probably work pretty well. But you can't just dive in and say, I've got a plan to do 10 things to reach my 10 goals, and I'll just do that to the death, because you really have to try things out early, frequently, incrementally, and measurably, usually, in order to sense when things aren't going wrong, and you have to adjust your strategy or adjust your goals.
No, I think this is a huge principle, the principle of feedback. Principle of feedback.
Yes,
so it's
exactly.
instead of saying that I'm going to act, this is my 10-year plan, and in order to do that, this year I'm going to do this, next year I'm going to do that. The things that most of the strategies you come up with will have problems, and even most of the goals that you've formulated might have problems.
But we dream, we have great dreams in our values. And we are optimistic because people have sold us ideas or paradigms like a very expensive higher education is good for your life. And so we sort of believe that, or want to believe it. And so we'll get disappointments in the strategies for all kinds of reasons. We'll get disappointments in the ability to achieve certain levels of the goals before we're too old to enjoy it, that kind of thing. So, but now another thing is, we've got, by the way, you use the word feedback, which I use. I once wrote a paper for a Japanese lecture about the most important principles in systems engineering. And make a long story short, feedback was number one. I observed things that work and things that don't for decades. And I found that any method that has good feedback built into it tends to work very well. Any method that denies feedback and just goes straight to the Big Bang tends to fall flat on its face. Okay, and
Absolutely.
many people have observed this, but yeah, so if there was just one idea you walked away with, ask yourself if there are good feedback mechanisms in what you're doing. If yes, you're probably going to be okay, no matter what. If there's some commitment, but for example, committing to an 8-year education at extremely high cost, when you don't even know if you're capable of it or you like it, that's not a gradual, trial and error feedback. And you might say, well, but how can I get that education if I just don't commit to it? I've got to get to the end. There are ways of doing that, in fact. But, very large commitments that are irreversible, the 8 years of your life you won't get back. The $3 million you had to pay to Harvard, you were not going to get them back, okay, no matter how badly it goes. So if we can find incremental ways of achieving our dreams, then that's the smartest thing to do. And my belief is that there are no such thing as things you cannot decompose into small bits. You might say, well, yeah, but surely, an 8-year doctoral degree or surgical degree, you have to spend 8 years. And I say, no, that's not true. We can sit down here and talk about the increments you can do to prove that you're on the right track, that it'll work, and things like that. And even under what conditions you'll jump off and take another specialization or a totally different life.
I want to connect this with the idea that we had discussed last time we talked. And that is the idea of your Evo system of implementing projects. One of the key points that you made is that you have to, for each of the iterations, you have to actually deliver value to a stakeholder. And that will tell you whether you are on the right track or not, and you are able to make corrections. Here, the stakeholder is yourself. So you actually have to take the action and make sure you are actually delivering value to yourself, to make sure that you are actually making progress towards the goal you said.
This is my practical, the EVO method, or evolutionary value delivery method, is my practical tool for doing this. Yeah. By the way, there's a point where we're not touching at all, but you triggered me when you said, you as the judge. So a point I make early in the life design book and all my other books is that there's a class of entities which systems engineers call stakeholders. And I remember some of the people here said that the stakeholder, being conscious of stakeholder, one thing they really picked up from our talk. Now, so even if you're designing your own life, if you start thinking about it, there's some very interesting other stakeholders, like your old sick parents, your children, your better half, your community, right? Your laws in the country you're in, okay? And etc. Now, stakeholders are really just sources of requirements, okay? By identifying stakeholders and not saying it's not just about me, it's about us. I feel like I'm holding a political speech after having become president-elect. It's not about me, it's about us. And once you get that us out there and start examining, what are my children going to expect from me in, before they're 18 or something like that? Okay, what is my wife actually expecting from me? And can I just dive in and do 10 years of this career where I have to travel outside the family while the children are growing up, which, by the way, I did. And that was kind of a mistake looking back. I wasn't looking at my stakeholders, my family and wife well enough. And okay, so by going through the stakeholders, identifying them, say, yes, I do care about the stakeholders, or in the case of laws, I have to care about them or I'll get thrown in jail, okay? And then identifying your objectives in that context, like, delivering quality time to your family. Take an example, so delivering quality time is the value, and to your family is a special subset. Quality time to your co-workers is a different subset of that. And that'll give you a much broader perspective, a systems perspective on your life, that you're looking at not just what's in it for me, but actually what's in it for us. I think it's a wonderfully simple way of putting it. And hallelujah, Joe Biden, he's got it, and the other guy doesn't.
Yep. No, absolutely. And the other thing is that these other stakeholders will give you feedback too. Your wife will tell you something, and your children will tell you something. And if you listen to them very carefully,
the law will give you feedback if you're violating too.
Yes. Wonderful. So I think we have covered the first three pretty well. Okay. Let's go to the fourth one. A life plan will allow you to take maximum advantage of desirable opportunities, and it will help you to avoid problems. So talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Now, one thing I want to make very clear, a life plan is not a static thing that you do once when you're 18 years old or 20, I believe that as you learn from two things. You learn how well your plan is running, the feedback, but your environment is changing all the time. Suddenly there's a war, there's a COVID-19, there's a depression, there's a death of a loved one. So the fact is, when we have to be prepared to change our plan, both our objectives and our strategies at any time when that makes sense. Okay, so these plans are flexible, they're not static. Okay, and then so given this dynamic planning situation where we're prepared to update our plan, and by the way, without any formal planning and writing, a lot of this is going on in people's heads. Okay, they have some idea of a plan and some idea of strategies, but they may not be very conscious of it. So, for example, they can't easily ask advice like from a spouse or a parent. Do I have a good plan? Because it's all up there. The moment you take the trouble to write it down and share it with a trusted person, especially a wise trusted person like grandma who's been there, done that, you're going to get some more interesting advice than if you just keep it inside yourself and keep it secret. Okay. Okay. So that's about that. Now, the principle 4 is basically saying that this framework every time somebody comes along, say, hey, I could, if you stop university right now, I could get you the most fantastic job in the most fantastic corporation, which will be better than university. Okay. At that point, you take that up. You don't say, well, I can't possibly do that because I have a strategy to go to the university and finish off my degree. But you can take it and you can plug it into one of these tables and say, how does that impact my objectives, my values? Okay. By the way, we don't only look at values or objectives, we look at what we call constraints. And some of the constraints are like the amount of time we have, the amount of money we have, the credibility and trust in our friends and things like that. And so we look at if the pluses and minuses. There's another simple way of saying it. And you might take a look at that, drop the current education, maybe pick it up later. Maybe I made a decision to do that and do, if you like, night school for the rest of my life, kind of thing. But I had a fantastic job opportunity in IBM, for example, at the time. Most people went to university to get a job in IBM. And I was in the middle of my education able to get a job in IBM, which at the time in the computer business was the best university of all for learning about computers and things like that. So I made that decision to downgrade my education, and it never stopped. Every little book I write today is a part of my education. Writing a book on sustainability planning taught me all about the level of planning at United Nations and charities. And that's just one of 5 books I did, last year. So I'm still educating myself, but I educate myself by writing a paper or a book and communicating to people and getting feedback. That's my current, at soon 80 years old, educational systems. I haven't given up education, but I did give up full-time at University of Oslo and, getting a doctoral degree and becoming a professor. Could have done all that. But looking back, I made the right decisions. I was very happy in a good company like IBM. It was certainly good for the economy of my young family that I had a job and not mounting student debt, one of the big problems in US at least. So yeah, so things will happen almost unexpected on the way, opportunities, right? And you shouldn't say, I can't do that because I have the plan to finish this education or even stay in this job. You say, let me evaluate it against my current goals and constraints. And if it turns out to, go very, very green, fantastic, then, consider it. And you've got a set of reasons for doing it. It's better for this and better for that, not bad for anything. It doesn't cost anything. Why not? Okay. That's what principle 4 means. You can use it to, you can run through that list yourself. You can share it with your better half or good friends or parents or whatever it is. And say, I'm thinking of making a very dramatic change in my life, but here are my reasons. Have I missed something here? And my son recently, he's now, let's see, how old is he? About 52. He made a very dramatic career decision last month. I won't get into it, but he understands these methods very well. He's professional in them, and he did it for all the right reasons. And but at 52, there was a career, a life-changing career decision to be made, as with many people. But it fit very well with his values and constraints and family and everything.
I want to pick up on one point that you made, because that's really the heart of principle number 8. Life is too complex to follow a formal design perfectly, but life is so vital to us that its very complexity insists on a formal plan. So expand a little bit on the critical necessity of having a formal plan, even when you know that it's going to be changed all the time.
Sure. There's a very famous quotation I'm sure many of you have heard. I think they attribute it to a Prussian general. What was his name? Clausewitz, and then Eisenhower. But something about it's the exercise of planning itself, which is important, not the actual achieving or executing the plan. So it makes you think. And I found that the 1 hour exercise of getting people to list and acknowledge their own values, it's quite amazing. They say, well, gee, I've never really taken that into enough consideration. I've forgotten to do that. And you've already pointed out that my strategies were already violating some of my values, but I wasn't. So that mere act of planning makes you conscious and makes you personally acknowledge what your values are, okay? And many people have gone through decades of their life with little or no formal acknowledgement. I mean, it's all in their head right now. It's always there, but I'm talking about writing it down, sharing it, reviewing it, and improving it, which is a totally different process from doing all. I think there are certain people, class Tesla and Elon Musk, who can do this in their head, you know, and they can probably memorize an 800-page book and play chess blindfolded too. But most of us don't have that capability in our head, even quite intelligent and good people. So what I'm saying is, if by bringing out the ideas in writing and sharing the ideas with yourself on occasion, like reviewing them every year, sharing them with, you know, other trusted people, because they can't get into your head, that triggers processes that wouldn't happen otherwise. Okay, I'd almost like to tell a story which is in my life design book about Sylvia, which illustrates this so nicely. The bottom line is 1 hour of planning might save 7 years of your life. Okay, can I tell the story?
Please do.
Long shaggy dog story, might take, but it's in the book. Okay, so I arrived in Brazil to hold some lectures, and a young lady called Sylvia picked me up at the airport and said, "I am your simultaneous interpreter into Brazilian." And my job partly just to drive you to your hotel and dump you, but I also have to talk to you because I have to know your thinking in advance so I can simultaneously translate quickly and correctly. And so she said, "By the way, if I can dump you at your hotel as planned, but you can also come home, my home for dinner." Well, couldn't resist the invitation. You know, hotels are same all over the world. Now, my first day in Brazil, get invited to a real Brazilian home. I arrived home. She has a husband who is the director of the Nuclear Energy Agency. She runs a company with 30 simultaneous translators. So she's a businesswoman. And she has 2 young children, about 10 years old, she's bringing up. She also has a chauffeur and a maid and a cook. Okay, so middle-class Brazilians. Anyway, we sit down, she said, "Tom, tell me about your methods. I have to brief myself for the translations tomorrow." And I said, "Well, I help people plan stuff, you know." And she said, "Well, tell me more about it." I said, "Well, I'm not sure you'd enjoy the technological part of it, but I can put it in a different way. I can help people plan their lives. This is where my life design really begins, doing these kinds of things." And she said, "Oh, tell me about that." I said, "Well, I could tell you about it, but I could also demonstrate it." And she said, "Okay, demonstrate it." And I said, "Okay, what's your most important objective in life right now?" And she said, "It's to get a qualification for international simultaneous translation into Spanish." Remember, Brazilian Portuguese is her language she's professional in. Then I start what we sometimes call the Japanese 5 whys, a series of whys that bring you up to higher and higher levels of abstraction or thinking. And I said, "Why, Sylvia, do you want to get the qualification in Spanish translation?" And she said, "Well, when there's a lull in the business, there are all kinds of South American conferences happening, even in Brazil, and there's a business need for that, and I could earn more money." Okay, so simple answer, to earn more money. Okay, I said, "Why do you want to earn more money, Sylvia?" Because I was looking at a fairly opulent person and family from the outset there in a very poor country. And she said, "Oh, well, the reason is we have hyperinflation in Brazil. And my husband, being a civil servant, his income almost gets wiped out by the inflation. And so does mine to a degree. So we need more money." I said, "Why do you, so they need more money because of the hyperinflation." Okay. And said, "Okay, I think I know how to solve your problem." Oh, yeah. So at that point, she said, "I have to go shopping for the dinner. Would you like to come along to a Brazilian supermarket?" And of course, I said yes. I'd never been to a Brazilian supermarket. And we went along. She spent about an hour and came back with the goods for the dinner. And I observed that she did this every day. She went shopping for an hour in a Brazilian supermarket. So I said, I can, if I don't get the story wrong at this point, I said, I have an idea. I have a new strategy rather than use. Oh yeah, she told me that this Spanish translation, it took like X years. I think it was 6 to 8 years to get the qualification. There's only a 5% chance she'd pass the exam. 95% didn't ever pass the exam. So this is like a big bang bad bet with a lot of stages. So she could risk investing 6 years of her life and fail. Okay, so it didn't sound like a good strategy to me. So I have a much better strategy. Sorry, I have to go through another level here. I said, why do you want to earn that money and have more money available? And she said, then I wouldn't have to work so much. Now, this was illogical to me, but that's what she said. If I earned more money, I wouldn't have to work so much. Well, she'd have to work pretty hard to get her qualification, okay? But she would work more to earn the more money. So it wasn't logical, but I said, okay. So she said, I wouldn't have to work so much. I said, why don't you want to work so much? And she said, because I'm pretty stressed. I'm a mother, I'm running a company, I have a husband, I have a household, running the staff. I just need a little bit of free time for myself. Anybody here feel recognize the situation? And I said, well, why do you need that free time for yourself? And she said, because then I could meditate. And I said, why would you want to meditate? She said, because I feel nearer to my God. I didn't ask her why she wanted to feel nearer to her God. But notice I've gone 5 levels up. At this point, I said, Sylvia, I've got the solution for you. I've got a new strategy. What's that, Tom? He said, well, basically what you want is an extra hour a day to meditate, right? Well, I've seen where you spend the hour going to the shop. Now, if you don't do that shopping, you've got your hour, right? How do I do that? I said, you send your cook to the shop every day to buy stuff. And she had what I call an objection. The objection was, number one, my cook can't drive and you have to drive to the shop. I said, you have a chauffeur, get the chauffeur to drive her to the shop. Okay. And then she said, well, I still can't do it. I said, why not? Because my cook isn't that smart and she wouldn't save enough money, and we've got to save the money because of hyperinflation. So I, the slightly smarter shopper, has to do the shopping. I said, Sylvia, you've already told me that you value communion with God over money. This is a hierarchy. I went up to her higher level of priorities. And she said, oh, you've got a point there. 3 months later, I arrived at the airport. Sylvia picked me up and she said, Tom, guess what? I said, what, Sylvia? I'm probably the only housewife in Brazil whose chauffeur drives a cook to do the shopping every day. And I've got my hour.
Wonderful. It's a fantastic story.
True story.
I want to focus on 2 principles together because they kind of amount to the same. I think they're pointing to the same issue.
Right.
Number 5 and number 10.
5 and 10. Okay.
So you have a choice: plan your life or be pushed around by it.
They do indeed have a correspondence there. Maybe almost identical in practice. Yeah.
Right. And the 10th one says you're the only one who can plan your life. If you don't, then other people's plan will mess it up. So it's, the thing that I see here, I mean, kind of taking a view of all these 10 principles together, it's the power of formal planning, explicit planning, and then acting on it to get quick feedback, rapid feedback from your plans, and keep altering them to match your goals, to be as clear as possible about your objectives. So I see, like, be clear about your objectives, make formal plans, act on them, get feedback, and relentlessly keep doing this, something like that. Does that kind of capture the gist of what you're saying?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Okay.
Now, but on these principles, notice it's saying you can't buy the plan from somebody else. You can't read a book where the plan is already there, 10 ways to success or something like that. Because you and only you, the values we're talking about are highly subjective. They're your personal decision, your feelings. Okay. So, and they change and they alter with experience, right? So you're the only one who can make a plan that you believe in and feel good about and keep that up to date as things change. You're the only one. Nobody can do it for you. You have to, that means you have to take the time, not a lot of time. We're talking about an hour to a day to get started on this, right? We're not, and if you might save 8 years of your life by spending an hour a day, well, that sounds like a good idea. Okay. So, yeah. So, and then the other thing is, if you don't have this plan, then life will buffet you around in various ways, you know, deaths and COVID-19 and lockdown and you name it. And you won't have a chance. You'll just sort of go with the flow, path of least resistance, but you won't be able to say, this is violating my plan, but not if I live in a hotel instead of my house or something like that.
Yep.
Okay. You won't be able to relate it to your plan and take any other decision except, well, lockdown in my house, I'm all done.
Yep. Wonderful. So Tom, I'm going to now get people to ask questions. I'm sure they have lots of questions. So folks, we have 4 rules. Number 1, type exclamation mark to ask a question or raise your hand in Zoom. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, feel free to disagree with anything and do so courteously. All right. So I'm going to give a few seconds for anybody to ask questions. I have plenty of questions, but I'm going to give preference to the audience. Give me just a second here. All right. So go ahead and type an exclamation mark to ask questions. I'm going to pause for just 5 seconds and then I will go ahead and get things started. All right. Okay. Okay, Julie, you're first. Julie, try to be brief. Try to ask questions. Okay, go ahead.
I don't quite understand this yet, but can you get through doing this? Can you find out something like maybe you're unconsciously working on a stakeholder's agenda more than your own life plan?
Absolutely.
Can that be a point of discovery?
Like being your mother's daughter or something like that.
Or trying to please someone else, or just not really authentically yours?
That's a really good point that I haven't thought too much about directly or brought out, you know, that by identifying the stakeholders and their needs, and then what you do is you make a decision whether to satisfy you have to satisfy their or want to satisfy their needs, right? But in doing so, you can find a person, you know, the boss, the parent, that is in fact wants something from you, but you don't feel that's right to give it to them, and it's going to destroy your life. So, you know, they maybe want you to follow a career, and you really. I was studying sociology with a young Spanish guy once, and he said, I'm so happy to be studying sociology. My family forced me to study law and get a law degree. And I was never happy with it. Now I'm free, I'm in Norway, and I can study sociology. So in other words, one stakeholder's parents had pushed him too far and wasted his life for several years studying what he didn't want to do. And he gave in to that because he didn't have a counterbalance, you know, my life plan saying, sorry, mom and dad, I want to be happy. I won't be happy with law. And so I'm not going to do it. Kick me out if you want, but that's the way it's going to be. But excellent point, Julie.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Next up is Martin. Martin, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I want to know, Tom, what do you think about when you set a plan or something like that, and let's say you choose a boat, for example, and how do you know when you need to change the boat, or you still going there? I mean, you have a goal and you don't get there yet. How do you know if you need to change that boat to go faster, even for the feedback that you said? But how do you know how to change, or when to change, or drop off, or still there because you're near your goal? How do you know that, or what is the methodology that you have to?
Yeah. So in a word, we did talk a little bit about feedback, but not enough. So I can bring out some more points here. You have to have regular feedback. In other words, you can't wait 2 years and then get feedback. You've just wasted 2 years, right? So the feedback frequency has to be more often. When I'm dealing with my business planners, I try to get weekly increments. And at least I try to get no more than 2% of, say, a budget or a deadline. Okay, in other words, 50 increments. Divide things, because if you, for example, get feedback every 2%, then the worst thing that can happen is you totally waste 2%, which doesn't usually kill off everything. Okay, you can get away with it if you learned a hard lesson. It's a sort of a gambling strategy too. When I go to Las Vegas, I bet exactly $10 on either red or black, and then no matter what happens, I walk away with my winnings or my loss. That's my strategy for. But I don't say, oh, I'll win it back. That's the loser's game as far as I'm concerned. So in other words, I have, if you like, a risk minimization strategy, saying sufficiently small feedback increments. And that means you will get off track, but you won't get too much off track before you discover you are off track and can make decisions, whatever they are, usually changing your strategies. So yeah, so that's one. Now, the other thing is, we have a notion of measurement. You don't always have to measure things. Sometimes it's getting feedback, like your boss says you're fired if you continue that behavior, is enough. Okay. But in general, I believe very strongly that most of our values can be expressed quantitatively. You don't always have to go there, but sometimes going there makes you think more deeply about the values. For example, what do you mean by happiness, your happiness, and how would you measure it, right? And you say, I just want to go gut feel. If I'm feeling happy, that's good enough. Okay, for many purposes, it is. But happiness can be measured. For example, the state of Bhutan has its happiness measure for the whole Bhutan economy, or no, the whole nation. And the United Nations and others have happiness surveys for the whole world, and they measure happiness on a variety of factors in a lot of different countries. So no doubt happiness can be measured. But that's the kind of thing people give up on, say, well, happiness, that's sort of wishy-washy, feely-touchy stuff, so we can't measure it. But just remind you, most all of these things that seem wishy-washy, like, happiness and success and flexibility, if you Google them and put the word metrics after them, you will find lots of people quantifying them and measuring them, getting feedback. And even at the level of a single person can be done. So long story short, there are values that you should quantify, and then you measure each week if you are moving, and you did hint at that, moving towards your goal. If you're moving towards your goal at a rate which is consistent with reaching your goal on time, then you're okay. But if, for example, your movement towards your goal says it will take 5 years more than I thought, then it's time to change, even though you're moving towards your goal to some degree. So the rate of change or improvement in relation to your long-term numeric goal is something that you can use even at the personal level, although normally you have to use it in business and engineering, and you can use it for certain purposes in life design.
Next
Sorry for the long answer.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Martin. Next question is from Brian. He doesn't have a mic, so I'm going to ask it for him. How do people react to using these principles for life design without use of a coach or trainer?
Okay. I think a coach or a trainer is a very useful thing here. And in fact, if some of you want to start a new career to be a life design trainer using my methods, be my guest. I sometimes think it's the new form of psychotherapy or something like that, because that's what psychotherapists do. They do something like this through their process and help people understand themselves and what they're doing. So I think there are career and business opportunities here helping people. I know from experience that the people I do help really like to get the help. I can't just maybe I can hand people the book, which I'm trying to, and people go off and do it and they don't tell me, but I don't usually get people who say, I've used your book for a while and it doesn't work. Would you now help me? That would tell me the book alone wasn't working, that coaching is necessary. So I have a feeling that coaching is necessary. Now, people are different. Some people I know can read my books and do everything brilliantly. Let's just say they're 1 in 100. Most people with totally new stuff won't really get going or keep going without some kind of coach. Doesn't matter how good an athlete you are, having a good coach is a real plus for making progress. So I think, unfortunately, coaching is probably a necessity for generally succeeding. And but if you're one of these self-starters who can teach yourself this stuff or get a little help from me for fun on the side, then maybe you know, I really think it's a career opportunity for some people. Do nothing but life coaching.
Wonderful. So folks, what we're going to do now is we're going to do a short breakout room of about 20 minutes to discuss these ideas. And Tom is going to be in one of the rooms, and then we'll come back and we'll share our takeaways. What have we learned today? All right. And you know, when you come back, I'm going to repost the link for the book for those who want it. I'm starting the breakout rooms now.